Welcome, everyone, to the Information's TITV. My name is Akash Pasricha. It is Thursday, July 17th, and we have got a fun one for you today. We are talking with our Asia Bureau Chief, who is here from Hong Kong to give us a real ground truth view of AI startups in China. I am really excited for that conversation. We're also talking about a big investigation that the Information published earlier this week. And we're talking with Slow Ventures general partner Sam Lessin. That always promises to be a fun conversation. But before we get started, it has been a busy 24 hours in the Information newsroom, and I want to go through some of our reporting with you. This morning, we published the first look at the org chart for Meta's Superintelligence Labs. Alexander Wang, who is now Meta's chief AI officer, and Nat Friedman now oversee 3,400 people, according to our reporting. Wang reports directly to Mark Zuckerberg. Everyone who used to lead Meta's AI team now reports to Wang, which is quite remarkable to me. And one detail that I've got to include in here from the story, staffers have to pass through 2 layers of security and use employee badges with special privileges to gain access to the lab, a sign of its secretive atmosphere. I encourage you to go check that story out. The other story I want to highlight is we had a story yesterday about how Anthropic investors are now interested in backing the company at a $100 billion valuation. That is nearly twice the $58 billion valuation that it got just months ago. The most interesting part of this story for me was that we actually got a hold of Anthropic's margins. These are the gross margins and how that compares to OpenAI. And, it really just goes to show, the puck is now going to margins. It's not just a conversation about revenue. And so that was a great story that I encourage you to check out. The last thing I'll mention is that we have a breaking story today about the battle between fintech and crypto and the traditional financial sector. It's a story about you've got fintech and crypto on one side and JP Morgan and the banks on the other side. This is from our crypto reporter, Yuichi Yang. I encourage you to check that out. With that, we've got a couple other headlines for you very quickly here. The House of Representatives advanced their 3 major crypto bills. This is Crypto Week. We'll talk more about that tomorrow. TSMC raised its revenue growth guidance for 2025 to 30%. And then the last thing I'll mention is we've got Netflix earnings tonight. I texted our media reporter, Sahil Patel, to ask him what he's watching for. And he said to me that I'm watching to see if they acknowledge the growing rivalry between YouTube and Netflix. You've got creator deals and sports league rights in the mix now. It is a fascinating rivalry. Watch for that tonight. I want to bring on a very special person, our Asia Bureau Chief, Jing Yang. She is in New York, all the way from Hong Kong. And just to give you a little bit of context here, Jing has broken stories about ByteDance, about Alibaba. She leads our Asia Bureau in their award-winning coverage. They're coming hot off a victory of what effectively is the Pulitzer Prize of Asia. Jing, thank you so much for being here with us. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
So, look, ultimately, what I want to get to in this conversation is the ground view of what AI, where AI startups in China are at. But very quickly, we've got to start with NVIDIA. I mean, what do you make of, this new development that they're going to sell these chips? It's a bit of a cat and mouse game. We know how these regulations go and how they develop new chips around them. What do you make of the news this week, and how are you thinking about it?
Yeah, since you mentioned the cat and mouse game, maybe I just unpack the context for our listeners a little bit. So, NVIDIA has been in this cat and mouse game with Washington since about 2022. Basically, every time the U.S. export control updated its restriction, NVIDIA will then lower the specification of its GPUs so that it can sell to China again. And as a result, NVIDIA has developed several editions of like China-tailored GPUs. And then H20 is the latest in that effort. And
Right.
that it was, before it was banned earlier this year, it was the most powerful GPU that NVIDIA was allowed to sell to China, although it is, not, cannot even begin to compare with what NVIDIA is offering to customers elsewhere in its Blackwell edition.
And let's just make it clear, what exactly is the fear from the U.S. government?
The fear is that um, NVIDIA's chips are so powerful and it has been accessed by Chinese military forces, or allegedly, I should say, accessed by Chinese military forces to advance China's military capabilities. And then, given fundamentally, right, the fear the fears are rooted in the geopolitical tensions between the U.S. and China over issues such as the Taiwan Strait tensions and the South China Sea, where China has all these territorial disputes with a range of countries in Southeast Asia, right? So then that is sort of where then you go from there to why there's like enough evidence and enough compelling evidence in Washington that NVIDIA cannot be allowed to sell those chips to China. However, I also want to cite NVIDIA's side of the story that they repeatedly denied that they don't have any evidence to suggest that their chips have been accessed by Chinese military forces. That is a state of play. And going back to earlier question about H20 resumption of the sale in China, that definitely surprised a lot of people, even people who I know have been watching this most closely. Uh, and then the broader context in the resumption is that US and China obviously have been trying to reach some kind of agreement, some kind of grand bargain over trade and tech, right? And then this is sort of the first very significant progress that we've seen coming out of talks that have been held in the past months in Geneva, in London, etc. And there's a lot of discussion and speculation over what is going to happen next as the bilateral talks go on.
Right. I mean, that's one question I wanted to ask you with respect to the cat and mouse game. I mean, do you think that this is going to last? I mean, will there be new export bans that come in place, or what's your sense of that?
I think it remains to be seen, right? So remember, H20 is a part of the Hopper family of the GPUs, which NVIDIA has started to phase out as it tries to promote the latest Blackwell family of chips. And then, so I think while H20 has been resumed to be has resumed to be selling in China, actually the bigger question is, will NVIDIA first develop another China tailored chip for the US another China tailored chip out of its Blackwell offerings, and secondly, if it does, will it be allowed to sell those?
So this would be a chip that's better than the H20, but conceivably not as good as the chips that would be available here in the US.
It's actually hard to tell if it will be better than H20, because it all then again depends on whether Washington, will update its export control guidelines again.
Right, right. Let's talk about, let's come back to the chip story in a second. I want to move to the view from the ground with AI startups in China. I mean, look, your team was one of the first to report on DeepSeek and some of the developments coming out of that company. Um, where's DeepSeek at right now? They're developing their R2 model. They're having some challenges. Tell us a little bit about what you know.
Yes. I'll talk about DeepSeek and then move on to other startups. So, after DeepSeek became a global sensation, obviously it has been recognized, it has been elevated to status of national champion, national treasure in China as well. And then we reported earlier this year that DeepSeek also has received, at the same time, the national treasure types of treatment. When I say that with the quotation marks, actually what I'm talking about is that, for example, some of DeepSeek's key engineers have had their passport taken by the company, saying basically that's basically like a implicit ban on employees traveling overseas at their will. Um, and then on the other hand, any investors, even like very powerful state-owned, state-backed investors that want to meet DeepSeek funder, want to just gauge the company's interest, whether they want to receive outside funding, because bear in mind the company all the time, right, grow fully funded by its hedge fund parent, right? Then those meetings, DeepSeek actually cannot make a decision on its own whether they can even entertain just like initial coffee. Investors being told that prospective investors have been told that you need to go to our local government officials to ask them. They will set the priorities about whether and who we should meet. And then what we see is that then R2. I think DeepSeek never promised a timeline for R2. However, there's been reports, I think initially by Reuters saying that DeepSeek is going to come out in May. Obviously, that didn't happen, and then we're already in mid-July, and it still hasn't happened. We simply don't know. We know that DeepSeek CEO and founder Liang Wenfeng, he's a like an idealist and professionalist, right? We reported that he's just not been happy with the performance of R2, and as the expectation keeps building, uh, we're sort of in this really interesting tension where the longer you wait, I think the better you have to become. And
Right.
then we also reported that a very important I think something that people may not actually fully appreciate is that the kind of computational efficiency that DeepSeek achieved is because these engineers have become absolutely masterful at using NVIDIA's CUDA system. And that means that DeepSeek models actually, they're trained on NVIDIA chips written in CUDA, and then which means that when you deploy the models, it's also the best to be deployed on NVIDIA chips as well. However, we have just talked about the whole chip shortage in China, right? So whenever DeepSeek R2 comes out, there will be sort of an immediate chip shortage problem that China has to face. Like when I say China, I mean cloud providers and any companies that want to access DeepSeek models. Well, you can run DeepSeek models with Huawei's chips because it's not optimized for Huawei chips. You will lose something. It will not work as well as it's supposed to.
I remember your team writing that story. It was very fascinating to me how the export controls were having that impact. DeepSeek is one startup. What about Manus?
Manus is a very interesting case. So I would actually, take a slight step back. So when we're talking about the lay of land of the AI startups in China, I want to break down to the foundational model developers, the software application builders, and the physical sort of AI or the robotics space. So we talked about DeepSeek, and then in the software application, space, we see companies like Manus. What do I mean by like Manus? So you see, like we've seen a wave of agentic AI startups, all funded by Chinese engineers. Typically, they have, years of experience as working at the tech incumbents like Alibaba, Baidu, or ByteDance in China, and then they branch out on their own, and then they launch agentic AI applications, typically built on top of Anthropic cloud models. However, they are all targeting on the market outside of China, so sort of the global ex-China market. And then the reason that they do that is because they are targeting not enterprise customers, but consumer customers. And when you do that, you have to draw the line you have to walk the very tight rope, because of very tight censorship on speech overall in China, right? So then they all chose to, serve the global ex-China market. So you have this very interesting phenomenon that is bubbling up in the last 3 months, where Chinese-born and China-trained engineers funding agentic AI startups to serve the consumer market in global ex-China. How is that going to shape up? We don't know yet, but it is very interesting. And there's several companies. Manus is one of them. Then there's GenSpark, Lovart. I can give you a very long list that are all still at a very early stage, to be sure. So we don't know how they're actually going to fare. And then last but not least, moving on to robotics space.
It's a big one.
China has like this, a world dominating manufacturing supply chain prowess, right? Which is why Apple had to make 90% of its phones out of China before. And then so China has already like a sort of early, sort of a first mover advantage if it wants to also become a dominant or important player in humanoid robotics. And then there is also a lot of interesting development there. There's absolutely what we see in the US, in Silicon Valley, that a lot of money has gone into that space. The same thing has also been happening in China.
I should say, your team, along with Steve Levine, who authors our electric vehicles newsletter, you guys wrote a great story about the humanoid robot view on the ground, I guess, in China. It was a story that we'll link in the show notes. I'm wondering, as it relates to humanoid robotics, I mean, from your view in China, what is the most exciting development? What is the biggest challenge that sector is facing there locally?
Yeah. So I talked to several founders of like China's leading humanoid startups when I was working on that story. Um, I think the biggest challenge is still, in terms of a really cutting edge research when it comes to the intersection between AI and the physical application of that. Uh, China is still far behind the US. So then the biggest challenge for this Chinese entrepreneur is that they want to work with, either the American academia or talents so they can bridge that gap. And then they also feel like, American companies and researchers should come to China as well because you can do all the exciting research you want, but China is the place where you can execute, where you can see your research come true on an actual, robot, right? And then the entire supply chain is not entire, but the best and the most economical supply chain is in China. And I felt a very strong sense of wanting to collaborate with the US, with the counterparts in the US when I was talking to these founders. I think that would be a challenge.
Did you see any of the robots during your reporting?
Yes, I did. Some of them are actually really impressive.
What surprised you? I mean, tell me about the most eye-opening moment.
There is one particular robot built by a Shenzhen-based startup, and then the CEO of that startup used to be a tenure. He's Chinese, and he used to be a tenure professor at Ohio State University. And several years ago, he went back to China to do this. And then the gait of that robot looks really, really good. Like I mean, I'm not an expert to actually measure, all that tiny movements, but just simply by looking with my layman's eye, looking the gait performed by some of the best robots in the US. And by that one, I think they are pretty much, equally impressive.
Wow. Well,
Personally speaking.
I never thought we'd be talking about gait as it relates to robots, so it's very fascinating to me. Very quickly we got to go, but I just want to ask you one last question. What do you make of Jensen Huang's growing role as a political negotiator? This is something we saw in the news this week. What's your sense of how unprecedented that is, and what's your take on that?
It is definitely unprecedented, based on what Jensen did before and how he has been this year. Uh, our colleagues, Wen Ma and Chan Liu, recently wrote a story about how Jensen has been playing increasingly visible role in the highest political stages in both DC and Beijing. So in DC, it's very well known, right? He went down to Mar-a-Lago a couple of times, and
Right.
last week he also met with President Trump and then what we saw at the result was on the back of that was the resumption of Chinese sale. Um, However, and then we reviewed in that story by comparison, during the Biden administration, Jensen actually declined an invitation from Biden's team to have a dinner with him, and he instead chose to vacation on one of his homes, luxury homes. And then, and however, in China, the same thing is also happening. Remember several years ago when U.S.-China relations were relatively still amicable, often see American tech CEOs like Tim Cook and Elon Musk rub shoulders with senior Chinese leaders, right? But Jensen was nowhere to be seen in those occasions. However, just this year alone, Jensen has already made multiple visits to Beijing that we know of. The latest one being earlier this week, when just one day after NVIDIA announced resumption of Chinese sale in China,
Right.
Jensen delivered a speech at this international supply chain expo that Chinese government was putting on. And he in that when he was doing that speech, he actually took off his iconic leather
Really?
put on a traditional Chinese suit. And then on stage, he was heaping praises of AI models and the technology innovation coming out of companies like Alibaba, Tencent, Baidu, DeepSeek. And when he was being interviewed by Chinese media, he said, and I quote, "I'm very happy to see the AI development in China."
Wow, I think that's a good place to leave it. Jing, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it, and we'll have to convince you to come back on the show, even though it might mean some crazy hours for you. We'll have you on very soon.
I'm I'm always happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. For our next segment, I want to bring on our banking reporter, Michael Roddan, to talk about a big story that he published this week about about a company called SandboxAQ. He did an investigation into the company's developments and also how the CEO has been conducting himself at the company. I'm going to let him explain all the details. The best I can explain the company, he'll do it much better. Is that this company sits at the intersection of AI and quantum computing, which means it's already a pretty interesting company. Michael, thank you so much for being here. We appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks. So yesterday we published our second story on SandboxAQ. And so stepping back, you mentioned quantum and AI. These are two very futuristic technologies. Sandbox is right at the nexus of the two, or at least it's attempting to be. The company is chaired by Eric Schmidt, the former Google CEO. It's backed by an array of Silicon Valley's most powerful billionaires. So Salesforce CEO Mark Benioff, early Facebook investor Jim Breyer, Bridgewater Associates CEO or founder Ray Dalio. They put about $1 billion into this, along with some institutional money and an array of small investors. The whole show is sort of run by Jack Hittery, who's a serial entrepreneur. He's been doing things for about 3 decades after he dropped out of Columbia. He ran for mayor once. He's done charities. He's done financial services. He's done sort of everything. Last year, we took a pretty close look at the company. And we reported that it had sort of embellished a little bit of customer success in its pitches to investors. And we sort of tried to get under the hood. It's a very complicated business. It's got a few streams of work. So it's got this thing that it calls large quantitative models, or LQMs. So generally with AI, big AI companies, we know the LLMs, ChatGPT or, help me out, Perplexity. You type in, it gives you an answer. That's the sort of consumer facing version of it. With LQMs, it's a little bit different. This is sort of like numbers based. It's like math and equation based. They're trying to help companies or researchers discover new chemicals, new molecules, new materials for manufacturing. Basically, very complicated, very new, and very deep tech. There's another line of work called AQ navigation, which is sort of using the Earth's magnetic fields to provide an alternative to GPS. So again, very futuristic.
And you had some good reporting about who if it had any success selling this technology at all. I mean, tell us about the revenue findings you had.
Yeah, so coming to this week, I've taken another really good look at the company, and basically, I got a hold of some pretty detailed numbers going into Sandbox's revenue. And so last time we wrote about it, we were a bit like, we weren't really sure how to figure out what's real and what's not, and how successful this company is in terms of generating cash, which at the end of the day, it needs to do in order to justify its $5.6 billion valuation. In the first quarter of this year, about 90% of its revenue, which was only $10 million, came through entities funded by Sergey Brin. So there was 2 university contracts to research into these LQMs. Those were grants that were given to Sandbox by universities, but they were ultimately funded by Sergey Brin, who was the Google president when Jack Hittery, the CEO of Sandbox, was sort of working with a bunch of researchers inside Alphabet that worked on a bunch of work streams that later turned into Sandbox. So there's a sort of a big question about how much customer demand there is for Sandbox's services, and why the money is being funded by someone who's very close to the CEO and has been for a long time. the rest of the revenue, a very small amount, was made up of sort of trials by a range of customers. So things like airplane manufacturer Airbus or pharmaceutical company Sanofi. But these are quite small in scope and size. So we really under the hood of that company.
I want to jump in here because your story dived into the CEO's spending habits. It also dived into the company's spending habits. You got some details on the company's revenue. I mean, SandboxAQ is not a company that I have heard of before. You started reporting on them. Help us understand like what the implication of the story is. I mean, why should people really care about SandboxAQ and this story?
Totally. No, and so it's like on the one side we've got the revenue not being as great as you'd think that the company would hope it to be, and then on the other side there's obviously expenses. And this sort of revolves around Jack Hillary, who's this man about town. He's flying everywhere. He's on CNBC. He's on Bloomberg. He's going to Davos in Switzerland. He's out and about. He's meeting everyone, and he's always sort of promoting this company. And the image that he's presenting is one of great success. And I discovered that in order to fund that image of success, he's been spending pretty lavishly. And so we reported that he was investigated by the company after a complaint by an employee for pretty lavish spending on things like travel, entertainment, and including on women who had no relation to the company. So this is sort of like taking them places, wining and dining them. There was an instance where he took one to Wimbledon, and the senior employees at the company were pretty concerned about the way that the company was being managed. And so this all filtered up through a range of processes. And Hillary, we reported, was asked to pay back some of that money. But none of this was ever disclosed to investors. And I think that if I were an investor in the company, these are some of the questions that I'd want to be asking about.
Right. Well, it was a fascinating story. We have to go on to our next guest, but for those of you who don't follow Michael's reporting, he publishes very in-depth investigations and features like this. So he's definitely a byline to keep tuning into. Thank you so much, Michael, for being here. We look forward to having you on. And
anytime, thanks for having me.
Okay. For our next segment, we are going to a friend of the show. Sam Lessin is a general partner at Slow Ventures. The company counts Robinhood, Airtable, Solana, and Postmates among its investments. He is a friend of the show because, yes, he is the husband of Jessica Lessin, our founder and CEO, and he joins us. Sam, thank you very much for being here.
Excited to be on my first TITV segment.
We are excited to have you. Your face is everywhere, so we're excited to have it here now. Look, people talk a lot about late-stage investing and IPOs, the big flashy companies. We don't hear a lot about seed-stage investing, which is something that you spend a lot of time doing. I mean, help me understand what the current state of early-stage seed investing is right now in Silicon Valley.
Yeah, look, I think the first thing to keep in mind, which is probably unsurprising to anyone listening to this, is it's a tale of two cities, right? There is what's going on in the AI world, which is highly spendy, big valuations. There's a lot of energy and a lot of push to get sucked into that. And then there's kind of everything else, which is kind of sleepy, right? And I think that's kind of like what's going on at the seed stage market is, when I talk to a lot of my friends who are seed investors, the kind of grudging conversation is always, like, are we going to pay up and do these completely overpriced AI deals, which happen, right? But there's a pipeline for, or how disciplined are we going to be about going out and hunting things that are out of the market, right? Interesting and can become very good returns.
So, I mean, if there's not that much attention and it's sleepy, then why isn't there opportunity there?
Yeah, well, that's the thing. It's just hard to find. I think like the reality is, seed investing historically, generally it's very narrative driven, right? And if you think about why, it's because companies are born around, some idea that people have. There needs to be a capital pipeline in general after them, right? So if you're going to do a seed investment, you kind of got to know where the next capital is coming from. There was a period, especially post-pandemic, where the story was very exciting about these things because it's so easy to develop software and these markets are interesting. People are going very deep on specific areas of expertise. And by the way, they can monetize quickly. So like maybe the answer is get profitable, right? And go from there. I think it's a very compelling narrative, but you got to find the right opportunities. It's not easy to do at scale. Then there's the other thing, which is clearly a strategy, which is the later stage investors have made it very clear that they're willing to pay up for AI narratives, right? And so because of that, if you can find the right opportunities early and get into them, you kind of know where your bread's going to be buttered next, right? By the later stage investors. The problem is again, like it's such a spendy world in the AI space that, and it's so easy to tell early stage stories of yada, yada, yada AI that one, from a seed investor perspective, you're not really getting paid for the risk you're taking upfront, right? Because basically the valuations are too high to make any logical sense. And then B, it is really hard to separate out what's real and from what's not in the AI world. So it's a confusing time.
Well, I mean, look, let me ask you about, one of these, so-called sleepy pockets. Slow Ventures raised a creator fund. The creator economy is something that we track here at the Information pretty closely. We have a creator economy database. We track creator economy startup funding. I was actually pretty closely involved in tracking the sector. And last quarter in Q1, we thought things were bouncing back because funding doubled year over year from sort of where it dipped. And then in Q2, it was kind of flat. And so, Kaya is our creator economy reporter, we were kind of looking at it saying, okay, well, that recovery was short lived, but Slow Ventures raised a fund. And so, creator economy, like, why are you still doing it? Everyone seems to be taking a step back. Why are you doubling down?
So for me, like the most exciting part about kind of this moment in investing is not AI; it's the second order implications of AI, right? And I think actually, creator, I think is going to turn out to be one of the great second order implications of what's going on in AI, because everything in terms of building software and tools and all this stuff is getting highly commoditized, right? It's too easy. Building some piece of software, anyone can copy it. That's why SaaS is under stress. That's why a lot of these areas are very difficult. Creator is interesting, right? Because what creator says is, rather than traditional model being start by building software, build a brand, and you go from there, you say, no. What matters in a post-AI world is trust. It's communities. It's kind of these verticals in a lot of ways. And so if you start by saying, hey, who can we find who, as the great entrepreneurs who have already built that, right? They've kind of, step one for them was building the reputation, the trust, the identity in a vertical. Step two is building lots of software services, companies around that. That pattern, I think, is going to be one of the biggest implications that comes out of kind of this AI boom in terms of the patterns of company building. But here's the thing, which is again, seed investors are pulled in multiple directions at the same time, trying to figure out where to place bets and how to invest. And the problem with creator investing is that it follows a very different signature than, good old bread and butter Silicon Valley AI style stuff. If you put a few $1,000,000 into a creator to help them build their universe, right, on top of a great brand, on top of that reputation and trust, which I think is everything, it's a huge part of the future. There is no Andreessen check that comes next at a higher valuation that you then get to go show to your LPs and say, hey, look, we got a markup on it, right? And that actually is why we at Slow Ventures have an entirely separate fund specifically for creator investing, is it follows a different set of signatures and patterns. It requires a different set of LPs, and it requires a very different mentality, which is hard, right? When all your cool kid friends are really happy to plow money into AI stuff where they look like they get markups. Now, again, my thing on the AI thing is I'm not sure how many gets paid on the back end of it, right? I think a lot of these companies are going to get commodified way faster. Right? We'll realize we're already seeing with a bunch of these even splashy, exits that VCs aren't really getting paid very well on them, right?
Right.
The wing curves and whatever. So I'm very happy with our position, but it's a challenging time.
Just a couple quick rapid fire questions about the fund. So it's a $60 million fund. You raised it earlier this year. Average check size is what for these creators?
$1 to $3 million, own 5 to 10% of kind of creators early, where that money can really accelerate them. Like we are fundamentally seed investors.
And how much of the fund have you deployed so far? It hasn't been too long.
Not much. I mean, we only officially closed it in February, right? And so we're still kind of building out the thing. We've done our first 2 investments out of the fund. We've done creator investments before that as we figured out the pattern. But for us, the double down is going to be, look, there are so many great creators. We're not interested in pure entertainers. We're interested in people who are the god of their niche, right? They are best in the world at what they do, and there's compelling businesses to build around them.
And how do you find those people? I'm thinking about how VC funds assess founders, and then I'm thinking about how you might assess creators. Is it entirely the same? Is it different? I mean, how do you pick the creator to back?
Well, I think there's 2 things you just asked about. I'll answer both of them. The first is this question of how do you source, right? And here's the interesting thing. I think this is happening in VC broadly, is outbound, especially early stage, is dead. You don't go outbound to companies. Instead, you have to tell a story of the capital product you provide, of like what you're willing to do and how you're willing to invest, what you're interested in, and then let people come to you, right? So this is one of the big things I think for creator investing, but even more broadly, is the model of VC is just changing very dramatically, especially at the early stage. You cannot possibly go outbound the way you used to anymore, in my mind. And candidly, the stuff you get inbound by default is all AI slop, right? It's all trash, right? And so you need to be really precise about how you market, what story you tell, what audiences you're going out to, and then how you're sourcing that funnel on the way in. So that's, I think, very true in creator, but I think it's true more broadly. Then how do you pick it? I mean, this is, if you go back to the early 2000s, there was this whole narrative running around where people would say, look, it's very cute that these kids in college are good computer programmers, but they're not entrepreneurs. They're not real. We're going to need to pair them with a business person or a founder. Turns out all the biggest successes of that era were people who could do the job. They were great engineers. They were great builders, and they grew into being great entrepreneurs and CEOs, right? The same is going to play out again with creator. You find these really compelling people who do it for love and passion, right? They've built an incredible community in some subsegment of aviation or some subsegment of kite surfing, whatever it is. It's actually bigger than you think and more compelling than you think, with more spend than you realize. But they are authentically that, and they're hungry and they want to do more than just be a content creator. They are going to be the entrepreneur. So we're much less excited about that. Hey, you got to find that business person, the couple with the entrepreneur. It's like, no. We need to find the people who have that authentic love of what they do, and they have that authentic trust in their vertical, and they're excited to be entrepreneurs.
Right. I want to move on from creator. We have a couple minutes left. You've deployed nearly $1 billion at Slow Ventures now. It's been almost 15 years. VCs talk a lot about their wins. They don't talk as much about their losses. And so I want to ask, I mean, look, $1 billion in capital, that's a lot of bets. What is the worst bet that you have made in your career at Slow?
I want to point out the specifics, but look, I actually think one of the nice parts, one of the great parts about being a seed investor versus a late stage investor is you have permission to make mistakes, right?
Okay.
When you're a late stage investor, you really can't lose money. When you're an early stage investor, yes, you need the 1,000x returns, the 2,000, and we've had those. But the cost of getting to do those is you actually get to be wrong all the time. I have no problem being wrong.
What have you been wrong about?
Oh, so many things. Everything. I think the most obvious and kind of somewhat funny in hindsight ones is like the things that are just outright frauds, right? So if you're an early stage investor, you're going to have things you invest in that turn out to just be straight up fraudulent. Now, you don't want that number to be too high, but, for us, we probably run a 1% it's just fraud rate, right? And, we literally have entrepreneurs that are in jail, and then you've got the category of things where, I think one thing, you fall in love with an idea and you squint at the person, right? This happens all the time to seed investors. We're like, there's some market or idea you absolutely love, right? You think it's a great idea. You'd love to see it happen. And you look at the entrepreneur, you're like, they're not quite what I'm looking for, but maybe they'll grow into it. But when someone's not good enough, they're just not good enough. And I think that's like a classic mistake pattern. You also see the opposite, right? Where sometimes there's a person who's just unbelievably compelling, but their business approach isn't quite right. And again, when you're a seed investor, you expect evolution, you expect change, you expect pivots. And so you bet on the person, but it is sometimes you just have the person who, for whatever reason, is working on the wrong thing. So we lose money more than we make it, right? Like not in aggregate dollars, but like on a number by number basis, we definitely have tons of write-offs. One thing I think actually has been interesting the last few years is if you looked 5 years ago, any seed investor, us and everyone else, you look at your portfolio and be like, we have the wins, and then we have a lot of maybes, right? Because the capital is so robust.
Right.
Companies will just exist forever and get pushed along. I actually think we're entering a healthier period where there is a more natural mortality rate. Like when things don't work, people should move on, right? So we have tons of losses. And why is lots of reasons, but there are those clusters.
Got it. Well, look, I think you're in a fascinating spot with the creator economy. I'm excited to see what else you back. The last question before you go, Sam, is I've got to ask, the screenshots on Twitter with the small text, what's the deal, man? Nobody can read that. I got to squint to read that.
Well, here's what I basically say. There's a people
Very quickly, we gotta go.
You got to go what?
No, no, no. I don't know. I just want to hear the thinking behind the screenshot on the small screenshots on Twitter.
So if you're look, there's always a method to the madness. So what I basically say is that one of the most important things when you're doing anything, especially on the internet, which is of infinite scale, is you need to find your people, which means both finding people who love it, and it's actually good when lots of people hate it, right? So I think the most important thing the screenshot essays is, yeah, lots of people think they're ridiculous or like don't want to read them. Like, that's cool. Then you just don't care. So there's actually putting up barriers is important. Two is like, here's my favorite thing. The best thing on the internet is a medium for being extreme and causing extreme emotions in lots of directions. You know what the great part of screenshot essays is? You can write a headline that makes everyone lose their shit, but then because it's a screenshot, the whole essay comes with it whenever it gets retweeted. So if you actually are a thinking person and care to read it, you're going to find some interesting stuff, but people react negatively to the headline and they spread it like wildfire. So there was a...
All right, well, I now I understand them. At least now I get it, and when I get frustrated at. So thank you very much. We appreciate it. That is Sam Lessin, the GP at Slow Ventures. Thank you for coming on the show. That does it for today's show. We will be back here tomorrow on this stream. Again, it's 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern time. I want to thank Amazon Web Services, who is our presenting sponsor for this production. Thank you so much for joining us. This is The Information's TITV. We'll see you tomorrow.